going to be a class today on Myers-Briggs and Keirsey temperament. This is something I've been interested in for a while, and it's something that really relates well to our everyday lives. It's kind of helps quantify why people are different, how people relate, the different categories that we can find similarities with people, and how to describe those differences. There'll be PowerPoint slides which we'll put on the video. So we're on the first slide, the introduction slide. And this verse I like to start out with, which is Romans 12:4-8. And the part in bold there is the interesting part. So this is the verse of, we're all part of the body of Christ. We all have different functions. If we're all the eye, it wouldn't work too well. If we're all the foot, it wouldn't work too well. And I like the part in bold there. It says, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. And so, in a church we have, the pastor and the people caring for people, the people making food for people, the people visiting people in prison. There's lots of different functions, and so Myers-Briggs will help explain to us why certain people natively will want to do different things, and obviously the world would not work nearly as well if everybody wanted to and was good at one thing and everyone was really bad and didn't like doing other things. And so that's some of the power here. So if we go on to slide 2, I put some different questions here of stuff that I thought might be interesting, of questions maybe people have hopefully asked in the past, and stuff that Myers-Briggs and Keirsey can either partially or fully explain. So some of these examples of, why do I click with one person but have a hard time relating to or communicating with someone else? Why are some students so much more interested in school and seem to really get it? Why are other people really interested in sports and really good at that? Why are my kids so different? Why do things that work for me and that I learned when I grew up not work for my kids? There's lots of these questions we have. How do we quantify two people's different personality types romantically? What things might work together better or might not work well together? And one other interesting one I find is, so we all know the golden rule, do unto others as you have them do unto you. But it's interesting that sometimes Myers-Briggs can quantify where what one type might want is not what you would want in that situation, that we are different in some cases. And so I like to add slightly to that, saying, learn about the other people and do what you learn they would want you to do, as opposed to just do what you'd want done to yourself. Anyway, so Myers-Briggs and Keirsey, which we'll start learning about here, can answer a lot of these questions. The second piece I want to say is, if you're on the first slide, I'd subtitled this an in-depth introduction. So I realize a lot of people probably maybe have never heard of Myers-Briggs, etc. And partially because the way I am and I like to understand how it works and the depths of it, this will go from introducing it all the way to some pretty in-depth topics. So expect that maybe some stuff is going to be kind of hard to understand. You might have to go back and read it over if you're interested in learning about Myers-Briggs. But so as I expected, this first pass you just completely get all the pieces of it. But this kind of lays out all of the important theory around it. And if you then decide you're interested and want to use this in your counseling or life coaching, then you can dig into more, and like I said, I'll provide resources, books, and websites about it. And then a slight other note, so in counseling and life coaching, these concepts are very interesting, usually for the more high-functioning people, but they can help. So if we have, we're looking at a system of a family, and Myers-Briggs can often explain why some people aren't getting along in a marriage. They can help quantify why this person wants this or that person wants that. And so it's very interesting to be able to explain to people and provide them the resources to have a good path to resolving issues and learning about each other. And then in life coaching, that's actually part of the reason that Myers-Briggs was created, was to help people figure out what careers are going to fit me better, what things are going to excite me and bore me, So that's the kind of the stuff what we're driving to here and the usefulness here. So I have 3 slides on the history of temperament theory, Myers-Briggs and Keirsey. So I won't read over all these pieces. So the word temperament, actually, which is used pretty commonly to talk about different personality types, 60 BC to 370 BC was Hippocrates, and the Galen was in the early ADs. So they actually thought at that time, the theory was that the body had 4 fluids in it, and if those fluids got out of whack, then that's when you had emotions got very crazy. And so it was all about balancing all of your 4 fluids. They're like fire, and they had all these interesting fluids back then. And so some of you might have heard, so the temperaments that then Galen created was the sanguine, choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, all these ones you might have heard of before, which is kind of the early basis for some of these. And so interestingly, the term temperament, which now is personality type, actually started from the Latin word to mix, because it was if you had a bad mixture of these fluids, then that would mean your emotions were off or you'd have a different personality. So it's kind of interesting that it has nothing to do really with personality, but because they thought it did in the past, that's where that term came from. So then we move on, and the most important person probably is Carl Jung. So I'm sure most of you probably heard about him. So he was lived from 1875 to 1961. So he was a Swiss psychologist, and he did a lot of studying and building on his predecessors of psychology types. And he is the one that came up with and we'll talk about, Myers-Briggs has 4 major variables to it, but 3 of those variables he came up with he thought people in the world could be divided between those. You had a preference for one or the other. So we all have all the different variables, but you're either more extroverted or more introverted, or more thinker or more feeler. So Jung is the first one. So he came up with some of the ideas, but there was no real way to use it. So you could study it, you could think about it, but there wasn't very actionable. Like people couldn't actually go out and use it to learn about their friends and do the stuff that Myers-Briggs added on to. Anyway, so we move on to slide 4. So then, and he published his book in 1921 called Psychological Types, is where he laid out these 3 variables. And so actually, so he was over in Europe, but Catherine Briggs was here in the United States. And she, since her childhood, had been very interested in personality type and other stuff. And even though she nor her daughter had psychology degrees, they really dug into it. And so when in 1923, when Carl Jung's book was translated to English, for the first time, she realized that the theories she had been coming up with were kind of a much less mature and developed version of what Jung had. And so she then took Jung's theories, and then her daughter, Isabel Myers, worked with her, and they actually both spent their entire lives studying people. Through non-traditional educational means, they learned how to do some kind of psychological tests and studies, etc. And so throughout their whole lives, they developed what we call Myers-Briggs today. And they decided after a lot of analysis that they thought there should be a 4th variable, judging or perceiving, which we'll get into more a little later, that they thought things split more cleanly when you had that 4th variable. And so one of their big pushes was, so in 1923 is when they started their work, but after a couple decades of work, when the women went into the workforce for the first time after World War II, none of them had ever even thought they would work. That wasn't the traditional thing, and so they had no idea, am I better working in a factory making tanks, or better doing something else? And so that was the push, that they took what Jung had, added the JP variable, and then created the 16 personality types, 2 of each variable, and then made descriptions of them, and then kind of mapped that to what careers would work well for you. So maybe a very intellectual person that maybe likes to stay inside and not socialize too much, maybe more of a scientist kind of thing, or maybe, there's lots of different uses of it. And so that's where in life coaching today that this is so useful, that instead of someone going into, getting a bunch of education, going into some career and realizing this really isn't for me, I didn't realize the day-to-day would not be too exciting for me, they instead can learn about this, and then go into a career that probably will be more fulfilling for them. During World War II, that's when they first put out their first tests that could be used to figure out Myers-Briggs types. So the next development was Dr. Macaulay, who was alive from 1920 and actually passed away in 2003. So she was a PhD clinical psychologist from the University of Florida, and in the early 70s she came across some of Myers-Briggs' work and got very interested in it. And so she actually came and worked with them. It was actually at a conference. Her and Isabel Myers sat across the table from each other accidentally and kind of got talking, and over time decided that she decided to focus all her work on Myers-Briggs. And so her and Isabel Myers then, which is the daughter, then actually co-authored a few books, and she's the one that's attributed to really making Myers-Briggs more psychologically sound and more accepted. It's still not, so a lot of clinical psychologists still kind of consider it a little bit kind of pop psychology or other stuff, and not full because of its roots coming out of non-real psychologist study and robust study. But on the flip side, there were when Myers-Briggs were working, there were other clinical psychologists that were working on trying to come up with something similar, but using the methods, the robust, academic methods, they never were able to get to where they wanted to go. They kind of got stuck, and so some people attribute them not having to, quote, follow the rules, help them figure out some other stuff. Now, like I said, it's not as used in psychology as some other pieces, but they start a foundation for the application of psychology type, CAPT, and then they ended up writing official test metrics and manuals for administering Myers-Briggs and like I said, lend some credibility to the test and be able to help it be used in a more clinical setting. So she was then the president of the Myers-Briggs Foundation, is also another another foundation that's worked to develop Myers-Briggs, which is still around today and has, like I said, formalized manuals and instruments for doing tests. So if we move on to slide 5, Myers-Briggs today has been translated into over 30 languages, is used in over 100 countries, and according to their publishers, quote, the world's most widely used personality assessment with over 2 million assessments being administered annually. So it's used around the world. A lot of companies will type their different people because also it can help explain a lot of what bosses work better with what employees, what people are going to be happier in which jobs. There's a lot of applications for Myers-Briggs. So then one other piece is a guy named David Keirsey, who was a PhD psychologist. He was doing his own research kind of in parallel with Myers-Briggs towards the later part of it, and he actually did a lot of work based on the old Greek temperament stuff we were talking about at the beginning, like Hippocrates. He studied a lot of the real historical stuff and the temperament pieces, and so he then decided that what he came up with was actually very similar to Myers types. And so what he did is he adopted Myers' 16 types, Myers-Briggs 16 types, but then he added to that, and he actually made different descriptions for it. So they talked about a mix of things the types do, but also how they feel and what they're thinking internally, where Keirsey focused on the measurable external pieces of it. So how do they act? What do they say? All these kind of pieces here. And then additionally, he felt that where Myers will split the types into, say, like introverts are like this, or extroverts are like this, or intuitive thinkers are like this, he felt there was only certain ways you should split the type because some of the variables are interdependent. And so with 16 variables, you can split out lots of different combinations of them. He had a hierarchy of, he felt the intuitive sensor variable was the one that split the most cleanly and most defined two groups very cleanly. And then he made two groups within the sensors and two groups within the intuitives. But past that, he didn't think it was too relevant to go down and dig into each little variable, because once you start trying to say all 8 types that are introverted like this, well, some types are, but sometimes kind of aren't because there's other factors in interrelation between the variables. And so that's kind of the piece he added on. We're going to be learning both. A lot of times, since they're using the same variables, so like an ENTP is like used for Keirsey and for Myers-Briggs, so a lot of people get them confused. So there's a lot of stuff actually Keirsey did that's been attributed to Myers-Briggs. People will read it and learn about it and think it's actually Myers-Briggs. But in the end, they both work together and they're both interesting, and it's not really that important, exactly where it came from. Keirsey has a temperament sorter, which is his test, which there also is an official instrument and manual that can be used in clinical situations. And so their test is in 20 languages, 170 countries, and has been taken about 40 million times since it was available 30 years ago. And then they were touting that more than 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies also use their test in different ways. Get into things here on slide 6. As we've been talking about, Myers-Briggs has 4 variables. We're going to go through all these as well as combinations of them. The 2 probably most important variables are your perceiving function, which you see as the second one in that table, which is either sensing or intuition, and the judging functions, which is thinking or feeling. So perceiving functions mean this is how I gather my data. When I perceive data, when I go out to do it, I do it in either a sensing way or an intuitive way, is the first function. And then the judging function is thinking or feeling. So once I have this data, do I make decisions based on thinking, and we'll describe these later, or feeling? And then the third variable, which is called the attitude, is what is my dominant world? This is a term that most people are probably familiar with, of extroverts and introverts, of more outgoing, talkative, like to be around people, and gain energy that way, versus are losing energy and prefer solitude or small groups of people that they're familiar with, is the attitude. And then the fourth variable, which Myers-Briggs added, is judging and perceiving. So a Myers-Briggs type is either one of these 4. So there's 16 possibilities, and everybody has both. So everybody at some times is by themselves and, quote, introverting and doing things without social interaction, and then at other times is extroverting, but it's which is a stronger preference, as they call it, for all of them. And whichever side of the preference for each of those, you'd pick a different variable. You note since introversion already has the letter I, for intuitive they use the second letter, which is N. And that's why we have the spelling there with the N capitalized instead of the I at the beginning. And so the example here, and the example we'll be using throughout the talk, is an ENTP, which is one of the 16 types. And so an ENTP would be extroverted on the attitude, intuitive on the perceiving function, thinking on the judging function, and perceiving on the lifestyle. So that's kind of how we put it together. And a good analogy I've heard is the preference is kind of like right or left-handedness. I believe that when we're born, God gives us the personality type that will fit best what he wants us to do with our life. And so obviously you can, just like if you're born right-handed or left-handed, you can work really hard to develop your left hand, but it's going to be a lot harder for you. You're not going to be nearly as good as someone that is left-handed naturally, but you can do that. And so we can, through nurture, can modify our type somewhat, but there's still a natural inclination that I believe is something you have through your lifetime. So if we move on to slide 7, so now we're going to walk through each of these variables, and I've created lists here of what I thought were some of the more interesting, and some of these are out of the different book references which I'll give. And as you can see on the top right, that the box function is what we're talking about now, so you can kind of keep it in mind of how it's in the ordering. So sensing and intuition. So sensors view the world in a very concrete, realistic, practical manner. They're taking in a lot of information on their 5 senses. Now we'll talk about internal versus external senses later, but so it could be their senses to the external world of, the 5 senses we all know, or it could be internal senses of emotions and pain and thirst and all these different things that are internal senses. So sensors take in these facts and live in the present. They're not usually asking in-depth questions. They're not interested in exactly how the nitty-gritty of how everything works. Now sometimes if there's a topic they're really interested or it's their career, maybe they'll dig into it deeply, but they work in a manner of finding experts or people they trust in different areas and collecting facts from them. They don't need to be the clinical psychologist with expertise on suicide or assessment. They can find someone that is and then get a lot of good information from them that they trust, and then they memorize these facts or write them down, and then they don't need to spend a bunch of time delving into it themselves. Yes, they're interested in the how. Often sensors have better memory because in order to have a large repertoire of information, you need to remember it well, versus intuitives that do things differently, it's not as important. So that's kind of the sensor side of things. And then we have the intuition side of things, so intuitives. So they're much more interested in the why. They live in kind of a futuristic, abstract world of how do things fit together, how do you dig into ideas, conceptually how do things work. They value kind of usually the future over the present. They learn by making connections. So they look at a bunch of data and say, whoa, that's interesting, that this, say you're making a sermon, so this version of the Old Testament, wow, that's interesting, that kind of the topic that ties to this topic in the New Testament, and then, okay, this piece over here, how does that work? And so they focus on this little strain of information, but they usually ignore all the rest of it. So for instance, if an external intuitive is in a room, maybe they were just out shopping for shirts. They might be analyzing all the different types of shirts people have, but they might be then completely oblivious to any other factor in the room, where a sensor would be just taking in kind of all the raw data, not really analyzing it, and just kind of taking it as fact, not really asking the why. So that's our first function. And this function usually, like I said, this is the function that Keirsey believes splits the 16 types the most cleanly. So this is the one that if someone's in one camp and someone's in the other camp, they're going to be probably the most different. Now obviously everyone is complementary and there's lots of other factors to them. And the other interesting piece is in Isabel Myers' book, they did a study of different seemingly successful marriages. So ones that have been around for a while but were not known to have problems. And of those 375 successful marriages, they found that this variable is the one that most commonly matched within the two types of the people married. Which is interesting. So that's sensing and intuition. So that's our first variable. So if we go into slide 8, the second variable then is the judging function. And so this is one, how do we make our judgments? We gathered information via whichever of the 2 functions, and then how do we make our judgments? So thinkers, value logic over sentiment, are very objective, are going to kind of usually make the quote logical decision. And I find this third one interesting, that obviously everyone wants to be truthful and tactful, but a thinker usually, if cornered, would choose usually to say the truthful answer, even if it wasn't the nicest answer, versus a feeler, which is much more worried about how do I affect other people, how do I care for other people, how do I make sure other people feel valued. They would choose to bend the truth a little bit to make sure that they didn't upset the person and that they'd be more tactful in it. So it's an interesting comparison. Feelers tend to be a little more subjective instead of objective, so the first bullet there, they value sentiment over logic. So an interesting one, they give praise generously. So that's just, it's very natural for feelers to do this. First thinkers in their logical mind would say, well, if I told you this one time, why would I need to repeat it to you many more times? So thinkers, like to use their skill set and use their information, and so might just debate for fun, whereas a feeler would usually avoid this because it could cause argument or conflict. Thinkers lots of times use people's names not too often and use more impersonal, logical language, whereas feelers use more value words and names. So thinkers, if there's some feelings or emotions or information coming in from that side that kind of conflicts with their thinking, their natural tendency is to kind of slightly ignore or suppress that information, as which is the opposite of what a feeler might undervalue logical things that come in and say, this is a negative characteristic of this person I care about. Well, they would really not like that, and kind of try to suppress it if possible, and so a hard or offensive truth would be hard for a feeler to understand versus an illogical emotion would be hard for a thinker to understand. So we move on to slide 9. So all of these things are happening. Obviously we have a world inside of us and we have a world outside of us. So all these things are happening either in the extroverted world or introverted world. Later we're going to get into what I call the full functions, which is you can have extroverted thinking or introverted sensing. You have combinations of these. And so the attitude here is extroversion or introversion. And so for each Myers-Briggs type, of course, you're either an extrovert or introvert. So extroverts, and the main focus of the difference is on energy. So we always think of extroverts as being the life of the party and social and enjoying being out with people, and introverts maybe being, more possibly shy or more timid or all these kind of things, but it's not necessarily true. An introvert can definitely have good social skills, can be the life of the party, but at the end of the day, they're going to be very tired after that, need a lot of alone time to recharge, where an extrovert is recharging when they're out with people, and therefore, if they're by themselves too long, they then get very cranky and need to get out of the house. So extroverts usually more gregarious, animated, enthusiastic, versus introverts more reflective, reserved, calm. Extroverts love being the center of attention usually, where introverts try to avoid it. And all of these are in gradients too. So when we take the Myers-Briggs test, you'll get results that say maybe you're an extrovert of 90 out of 100 or an extrovert of 4 out of 100. So obviously we're making some generalizations here. And as Kiersey called out, trying to isolate these variables completely is a little tricky because there's other modifiers on them. But these are kind of general traits that are true for most of the types. So other pieces, extroverts, they like new, unfamiliar settings. They're very comfortable. The external world is their normal world. So it's the one they're most familiar with. They're comfortable in it. They understand it. Versus for introverts, that's their internal world, which people don't see. And so that world is very rich and they understand it well, but the external world can be a bit tougher for them. So sometimes they need time to acclimatize to new settings, etc. And then the fourth function is judging and perceiving. Now the first thing I want to say is most new people to Myers-Briggs think because of the names that judgers are judgmental and perceivers, gather a lot of information or something. So this is kind of a misnomer. What judging and perceiving really is talking about is which function is in the external world, your perceiving function or your judging function. And we'll get into this more a little later. Your perceiving function is where you're gathering information. Judgers tend to be more decisive than curious. So they're usually more about making decisions, staying on schedules, executing tasks. They like to be more in control. They're usually on time places. They like making prompt decisions. They enjoy finishing projects. They, like I said, love schedules, all this kind of stuff. Or perceivers, you might call them more laid back. Like they do not like to have a schedule because that's kind of confining for them. They enjoy planning projects but not executing them. They tend to be late to things. They're kind of less organized, you'd say. So having that now, if we look back to what judging and perceiving is talking about, so your perceiving function is where you're gathering information. So a perceiver means that person's data gathering function is in the external world. And so that's what we all see. And that's why, and for judgers, then their judging function or their decision-making function is in the external world. So what you see of a judger is, I've already collected a bunch of information, I'm now making a decision, so I'm very decisive. Or for some types, if that's their dominant function is a judging function, they don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but they just execute. So you see them doing a lot of things, you see them making decisions, executing things, everything's planned, everything's worked out, but that's because they're in the decision-making part of their process. And actually internally, if you knew their internal world, it's not nearly as organized. And that's where a lot of judgers sometimes like to get things out on paper to help get things out of their internal world to their external world, to write them down to help organize them externally. Whereas a perceiver, they're usually out trying to collect information. So they haven't made a decision, maybe throughout a conversation, they might start with one idea, but then after talking about it, have another idea. And so that's why they appear to be less organized, whereas their internal worlds are very organized, but that's not what we see. And so that's where that naming comes from. And so a few people might say judges are slightly more judgmental, but the main focus is not on those names, it's the explanation I just gave there. Okay, slide 11. But one of the main pieces then is you combine these into, as I mentioned earlier, like extroverted thinking or introverted thinking, which is very different, or extroverted feeling or introverted feeling. Myers-Briggs theory says that we all have 4 functions, which is, like I said, a combination of 2 variables that we mentioned earlier. And these functions are the dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior function. So there's an ordering of how familiar are we with it, when do we develop it, and how much do we understand it, what is its function in our life. And this ordering actually probably has more effect on what the personality type is than some of the letters. So you can have 2 extroverts that are very different because they have very different function ordering, or 2 sensors that are very different because they have very different, because maybe one's an external sensor, maybe one's an internal sensor, which are pretty different. We'll get into some of that later. But your dominant function, they say, usually develop between the ages of 6 to 12 years old. This is your specialty. This is what you're the best at. This is what you go to first to try to solve your problems or collect information. This has the strongest influence on your personality. Your auxiliary function, which is a secondary function, then is an important balancing function to your dominant function. So, and one important thing to note is, so each of these functions, you notice I'm always saying extroverted thinking or introverted sensing, etc. It's always the perceiving or judging functions that are either extroverted or introverted. So if your dominant function is, say, extroverted thinking, that's your decision-making function, then your next function would have to be a perceiving function, which would also have to be introverted. And we'll get into this ordering here in a minute. So your dominant and secondary functions always a combination of one of them is how you make your decisions, and one of them is how you collect your data. So if you only have a dominant function, then either you're making lots of decisions with almost no information, or you're collecting lots of information, never making decisions. And that's why it's important to develop your secondary function. And so if you, sometimes people that you meet that say they're a perceiver, and so they're running around always having new ideas, always excited about something, but then the next time you talk to them they're excited about something else and they never actually did anything. That would be, they would need to develop their decision-making function, which is probably their secondary function. And so that's part of the reason it's so important to have those 2 functions. One balances the other, but also the secondary is required to actually do well in life, really. Third function, your tertiary function, is usually developed between the ages of 20 to 35 years old. My dominant function is extroverted intuition, but my third one is extroverted feeling. Thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition are in the ordering somewhere. And it's just which one are you more and which one are you less. So this is something that you kind of in mid, or 20 to 35 year old, you start learning about this other side, you start making some more decisions, you start becoming more balanced as you get a little older. And so this function you use sometimes if you're really having a problem or slightly more stressful situation, you can't solve it with your top functions, you might go to this function. It's kind of more experimental. And then your fourth function, called your inferior function, is usually developed between age 35 to 50, or some people never develop it at all. And it is kind of something that's just really hard for you to understand. And actually some people associate developing this with midlife crises, that in that part of your life you learn something new and learn how to see things in a whole different light you never did, and so maybe you make decisions that are not characteristic for yourself. Now, some people also talk about this, because this function usually conflicts with your dominant function. So if you see the ordering, you're going to have 2 decision-making functions and 2 data collection functions in your 4. So some of them are going to be conflicting with each other. Like maybe you're a higher thinker and lower feeler. Do you use that thinker to make the decision, or do you use the feeler to make the decision? So there's some kind of conflict between these types. And so one analogy that a friend of mine used once that I liked is your dominant function is kind of like the driver of the car, and the one in control, the one making the decisions. The secondary auxiliary function is like the GPS, so it gives important information, it can help guide you, but it's not making the decisions. The tertiary function, the third one, is like a teenager in the back seat. So sometimes they're working with you, sometimes they're working kind of against you, but they're reasonably organized, etc. And then the inferior function is like a little baby in the back seat. That sometimes they're very quiet, sometimes they're screaming out, and so you can have erratic behavior. It's very hit or miss, and they don't really understand much, that kind of thing. So that's the function ordering. And so slide 12 then, and I put advanced on this slide. This goes into the algorithm of how the ordering's figured out for a type. So this is a piece, definitely listen, maybe if you don't get this piece, it's not super important. Go look at a website that has a description of the 16 types. They'll have the ordering listed at the bottom. And so it's good to kind of understand how that's made, but you don't really need to derive it every time for yourself. So at the top, in the background, an extrovert's dominant function is extroverted. That's what makes them an extrovert. And by definition, an introvert's dominant function is introverted. So what I have here is, you notice the numbers in the slides, there's 3 steps to creating the ordering. And so if you match up step 1 over here, we'll talk about that's what we're building on the right side in this example. So the first step is probably the easiest, which is if the type's extroverted, then their dominant function has to be extroversion, and so and the types just alternate down the 4. So if they're an extrovert, and we're going to use the example of ENTP here again, and so for an ENTP, their dominant function is extroverted, and then the secondary introverted, extroverted, introverted. So they just alternate like that. So that's your first step. So the second step then is the piece that we're talking about with perceiver or judger. So if the person's a perceiver, then as we said before, the definition of a perceiver is that their perceiving function is in the external world. So you look at their letters and you say, which is the perceiving function? So perceiving function is always either intuitive or sensor. The ENTP here is an intuitive. And so we say, okay, intuition is the ENTP's perceiver function, and that needs to be in the external world by definition. So if we look here, and it needs to be either the dominant or auxiliary. So if we look here, the dominant function is the extroverted one, and so that's where we put intuition. So that's on number 2 there on the right. You see the top line, dominant functions, extroverted intuition. And then the other piece is, since this is an ENTP, the third letter is the decision-making function, which is the one that we want to use for auxiliary, because that's their 2. And you can kind of think of a line between dominant and auxiliary. That is what the, quote, type is, and tertiary and inferior is kind of the opposite of the type that, you don't understand very well. And so that's why the top 2 go there. So you see in diagram 2 there that dominant extroverted intuition, secondary introverted thinking. So at that point, then you go to fill in the tertiary and inferior. The tertiary is always the opposite of the auxiliary. So we had introverted thinking, so now we have extroverted feeling. So the other decision-making function is the third one, and the fourth one is the only one that's left, or the other perceiving function, which is sensing. And so this is the function ordering, and we'll talk more about this. And like I said, if you didn't get that, it's easy to look up, but that kind of gets you some background behind it. So slide 13. This is probably one of the most tricky pieces too, and as Kiersey would say, partially it's because you can't slice and dice it as much as down to each of these letters. And so it's kind of hard to pull out some of what exactly each of the 8 functions are, or full functions. But here I have some examples, and I'll walk through a few to help give you an idea. And so basically you take either the decision-making function, the judging function, or the perceiving function, and then they're either in the extroverted world or the internal world. We'll use the example of sensing. If you have an extroverted sensor, so we'll kind of describe what a dominant external sensor would be. So if this is their top function, then these are the people that are extremely good at taking in from the external world information very quickly. So, these are usually sports people, or actually soldiers in the past. These are the people that, can be, walking down the street and just picking up all sorts of information, way more than other types could, on their 5 senses. Now, they're not intuitives, they're not trying to analyze it, they're not trying to make patterns with it, they're just taking it in raw. And so one example I like is, I play sand volleyball, and so some of my friends that play sand volleyball are dominant external sensors. And so when I go up to spike a volleyball, I have to just concentrate and try to hit that ball, and I see nothing else. I cannot tell where anybody else is. I can't tell anything else. But there's a number of guys I play with that are quite good that can go up to spike it, but they can still pick out where different people, where's the block at, where are the other people around me, even possibly where did my partner move, and they can then adjust their spike to get around that block, etc. But that's because they're just getting so much more information than I am, not being a sensor, or not dominant external sensor, than they are. So that's an external sensor. And again, dominant means this is your specialty, so they're not going to be good at a lot of other things, but this is what they're excellent at. And a lot of people in professional sports are dominant external sensors. They also are drawn to the strongest external stimuli. So things in the external world that are interesting, that are, that really, so some of these people also are kind of the thrill seekers. So like, jumping out of airplanes and all this other kind of stuff, because they're getting so much interesting information in on their senses. So that's external sensors. So now let's contrast that to introverted sensing. So introverted sensors are very different, even though they're sensors as well. So they are the experts inside themselves at understanding and picking up different internal senses. So thirst, hunger, pain, muscle tension, all these different things. They're the ones, they have this rich internal world of just being able to understand and pick up and be very precise about how they understand it, remember it, just pick up so much more information than the rest of us. So it's taking these functions and where do you focus it, external or internal? And so I won't go through all of these because there's kind of a lot of depth here, but this is something that I would again call this a more advanced piece, that if you really wanted to get into Myers-Briggs, this is something you'd want to study more. But again, when you talk about the 16 personality types, there will be descriptions that describe how all these things play together, and this is what that type is like, and it doesn't require understanding all this depth. But this kind of gives you a glimpse at the more advanced pieces of it. So move on to slide 14. So these are then the two judging full functions: introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, introverted feeling. And so some examples here, I'm not gonna go through all of them. So extroverted thinking. So this is making logical decisions in the external world. So these people are usually like some executive, they're people that make usually quick decisions. So if they're a dominant external thinker, then we realize in their ordering that their first thing they go to is their decision-making function. Their secondary function, their auxiliary function, is then their data collection function. So this ordering means that they don't lots of times sit around for a long time collecting information. They get what they think they need and then they just go. And so they're very quick decision makers. They're very organized. They get things done on time. They're execute there, but they're not usually good at coming up with new grand ideas, because they're not going to sit around long enough to analyze all the different possible ways this could be done. Versus introverted thinkers are then focusing this logic and stuff on their internal world. So they're looking at information they already collected, they're organized and internal, they're making logical decisions, deciding, to buy a house. They're not going to look at the logical pieces as much. What's the dollar per square foot and what's the best resale value in the future? They're going to look at, how is my family going to enjoy this? My friends, how close are they around me? But the extroverted feeling is focusing on the outside. So they're quick to react to changing emotions of others. They're very concerned with how others are doing. They're picking up on a lot of things. They're going to be very verbally affirming to other people, etc. Yeah, so internal feeler, then they're looking at more internal feelings such as, say, love, patriotism. They have this rich inner world of a lot of caring, but they lots of times protect that. And so lots of times they actually can come across sometimes as cold or indifferent externally. These emotions and stuff they care about internally, they then do make decisions and do things in the external world, but it's a very different way of focusing that decision-making function.